It's strange, isn't it? A nation known for its power, its reach, and its relentless momentum, suddenly brought to a halt. Government offices stand empty. Paychecks stop. National parks close their gates. And across the United States, hundreds of thousands of people who keep the machinery of the republic running are told to stay home, or worse, to keep working without pay. This is what's happening right now. Chapter 1. The nation that hit pause. America, the world's largest economy, has entered another government shutdown, a phrase so familiar now that it almost feels routine, even though every time it happens, it leaves real hardship in its wake. Before I go any further, I should introduce myself. My name is Rufus Brown, and yes, I am an AI-generated avatar. I come to you in this form to protect my real identity. But please, don't let that distract from the message I wish to share. What matters here is understanding how the US government, with all its might and intellect, can end up in a situation where it simply runs out of permission to pay its own workers. A government shutdown isn't just a pause in administration. It's a symptom of deeper dysfunction. It happens when Congress and the President can't agree on how to fund the government for the coming year. Without that agreement, without a budget or a stopgap measure, federal law forbids agencies from spending money they don't have. And so the lights go out. Each shutdown feels like déjà vu, another round of blame, headlines, and last-minute bargaining. But behind the noise lies a long history of how America got here, step by step. To understand that, we'll need to turn the clock back to the roots of the modern budget system, and to the moment when political gridlock became a tool as powerful as any law on the books. Because only by tracing where this began, can we begin to understand why it keeps happening. Chapter 2: How the Shutdown was born. Every system has a breaking point. For the United States government, that breaking point lies within the very machinery that was meant to keep it running smoothly, the federal budget process. To understand shutdowns, we have to go back to the 1970s, a time of reform, distrust, and political upheaval. It was after the Vietnam War, after Watergate, and after a series of budget clashes between Congress and President Nixon. Nixon had been holding back money that Congress had already approved. In response, lawmakers passed the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974, determined to reclaim their constitutional power of the purse. This act created a new modern process for crafting the federal budget, setting spending ceilings, fiscal deadlines, and a timetable meant to bring order to the chaos. But it also laid the groundwork for a new kind of chaos, because whenever those deadlines weren't met, the government found itself drifting into uncharted territory. At first, these funding lapses weren't catastrophic. Before 1980, the government didn't actually stop when appropriations expired. Agencies simply kept working, assuming Congress would pass a budget soon enough. That changed during the Carter administration. In 1980, Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti issued a landmark legal opinion interpreting the Anti-Deficiency Act, a century-old law that forbids spending money not authorized by Congress. Civiletti concluded that during any funding lapse, government agencies must cease operations entirely, except for those essential to human life or national security. And just like that, the concept of the government shutdown was born not as a political act, but as a legal one. From that point on, the federal government could no longer glide through a missed deadline. The moment funding ran out, America's engine would simply stop. It was an idea that no one had fully anticipated, a technical interpretation that would, over time, become one of Washington's most powerful political weapons. Because once politicians realized the government could indeed be turned off, they began to wonder, what could be gained by flipping the switch? Chapter 3: When politics stops the machine. Once the legal idea of a shutdown existed, it didn't take long for politics to weaponize it. What began as an unintended byproduct of budget law turned into a recurring ritual of brinkmanship, a test of will between competing visions of government itself. The 1980s saw the first flickers of this new phenomenon. Under President Ronald Reagan, clashes over spending priorities led to several brief shutdowns, 9 in total between 1981 and 1987. Most lasted only a day or two, but they revealed something important: that refusing to fund the government could be used as leverage to force negotiation. In essence, the shutdown became a bargaining chip. But the turning point came in the 1990s. In 1995 and again in 1996, the U.S. faced two major shutdowns under President Bill Clinton and House Speaker Newt Gingrich. Republicans, newly empowered after sweeping the midterm elections, sought deep spending cuts and a balanced budget. Clinton resisted, calling their proposals draconian. For 27 days, the standoff paralyzed Washington. National parks closed. Government workers went unpaid through Christmas. In the end, public opinion turned against Congress, and Clinton emerged politically stronger. Still, a precedent had been set, one that proved the shutdown could be a stage for political theater. Years later, that lesson would resurface. In 2013, a divided Congress under President Barack Obama faced off over the Affordable Care Act. House Republicans refused to pass a budget unless the health law was delayed or defunded. For 16 days, the government stood still, costing billions in lost output. The bill was eventually passed unchanged, but the tactic of using a shutdown to make a political point had become firmly embedded. Then came 2018 to 2019, the longest shutdown in American history, lasting 35 days under President Donald Trump. The dispute centered on border wall funding. Federal employees missed paychecks, air travel was disrupted, and food inspections were delayed. Yet even after the government reopened, the wall was never fully funded as envisioned. Each episode revealed a deeper truth, that shutdowns were no longer symptoms of gridlock, they were expressions of it. They had become part of the language of American politics, where refusing to act had become a form of action. And so the shutdown ceased to be an emergency. It became instead a strategy. Chapter 4: The 2025 Shutdown, the Stalemate of the Century. And now, here we are again. The year is 2025, and the United States is living through yet another government shutdown, the longest in its history. What began as a dispute over budget priorities has hardened into something far more complex. A symbol of the deep political fracture running through the heart of America's democracy. The shutdown began at midnight on October 1st, when Congress failed to pass the necessary funding legislation for the new fiscal year. The House of Representatives, controlled by one party, passed a temporary spending bill, a continuing resolution. But in the Senate, it was blocked. The sticking points? Healthcare subsidies under the Affordable Care Act, climate-related spending, and procedural control over how future appropriations would be handled. On paper, these may sound like legislative details. But beneath the surface, they represent ideological battles over what government should be and who it should serve. The result has been paralysis on a national scale. Hundreds of thousands of federal employees are furloughed, many more are working without pay, and countless contractors have seen their incomes vanish overnight. Airports are beginning to slow down, with the Federal Aviation Administration warning of potential flight reductions due to staffing shortages. Federal nutrition programs are straining. State governments are scrambling to cover delayed federal funds, and morale across public service has hit new lows. Both parties, meanwhile, claim principle. Republicans insist they are defending fiscal restraint. Democrats argue they are protecting essential healthcare support for working Americans. But as the standoff drags on, the public grows weary of principle without progress. To most citizens, this doesn't feel like democracy in action. It feels like dysfunction in plain sight. In the streets and on social media, frustration mounts. Each side accuses the other of playing politics while ordinary people bear the cost. And perhaps that's the most telling measure of how far this has gone. Shutdowns were once extraordinary events. Now, they are simply part of the rhythm of American governance, an unwelcome tradition that arrives with fiscal deadlines, as predictable as autumn itself. This one, though, feels different. Not because it's longer, but because it's emptier, a contest where no one seems to know what victory would even look like. And that begs a sobering question. If the shutdown has become a normal part of political life, what does that say about the state of the republic it was meant to serve? Chapter 5. What happens when the government stops? When a government shuts down, the effects aren't felt all at once. They spread slowly, like cracks forming in a frozen lake. Quiet at first, until the weight of everything above begins to break through. The first people to feel it are the federal workers. Nearly 1 million of them, from scientists and safety inspectors to janitors and park rangers, are either furloughed or working without pay. For them, the shutdown isn't an abstract political event. It's a sudden emptiness in the wallet, the fridge, the future. Mortgage payments go unpaid. Groceries are bought on credit. And every time Washington stalls, they are told the same thing. You'll get your back pay when it's over. But back pay doesn't cover anxiety or the months of uncertainty that come before it. Then the shock spreads outward. Businesses that rely on government contracts begin to falter. Construction projects halt. Research grants freeze. Federal courts delay cases. Even airports begin to slow down as the FAA warns of staffing shortages and the risk of flight cancellations grows. In homes across America, the ripple becomes personal. Parents who rely on childcare subsidies find themselves on waiting lists. Food assistance programs like SNAP face delays. National parks, once places of calm, sit locked behind closed signs. The message feels symbolic. When the government stops, even nature seems to fall silent. But there's another less visible cost, one measured not in dollars but in trust. Each shutdown erodes public confidence just a little more. Faith in government becomes harder to sustain when the system itself keeps proving how fragile it is. Foreign investors begin to ask questions. Allies begin to worry. And ordinary Americans, the ones far from Washington, begin to wonder what kind of nation lets itself go dark over politics. Economists can calculate the billions lost in productivity. But what they can't measure is the psychological toll, the fatigue of a people who have seen this play out too many times before, and who no longer believe anyone in power is really listening. Because when a government stops, it's not just offices that close. It's a signal, one that tells the world that America's greatest challenge might not come from outside its borders, but from within them. Chapter 6: Lessons in the Dark. Every shutdown begins with noise, debates, accusations, press conferences, and finger-pointing, but as the days drag on, the noise fades. What remains is silence, the quiet hum of a nation running on half-power, waiting for someone to flip the switch back on. By now, America has lived through dozens of these shutdowns. Each time, the same lessons are offered: that governance requires compromise, that partisanship comes at a cost, that ordinary citizens pay the price for political stubbornness. And yet, the lessons never seem to stick. Maybe that's because the problem isn't in the budget, it's in the culture. A government built on negotiation now treats compromise as weakness. In the halls of Congress, victory is defined not by progress, but by how much pain can be inflicted on the other side. Meanwhile, the people who rely on those institutions are left stranded, wondering how a country that can put rovers on Mars can't manage to keep its own offices open. But perhaps there's something to learn in this darkness after all. Shutdowns, in their own strange way, expose the truth about democracy, that it isn't a self-sustaining machine. It's a living system, fragile, fallible, and dependent on the willingness of its people to keep it alive. When that willingness falters, the lights go out. Still, history shows that every shutdown eventually ends. Someone blinks, a deal is struck, workers return. Life resumes. The headlines move on and the cycle resets until the next confrontation. Yet each time, the cracks grow a little wider. And so tonight, as America waits once more in the dark, the question lingers: will this be another pause in a familiar pattern? Or the moment the pattern finally breaks? Because in the end, the government may reopen, but the deeper shutdown, the one between principle and pragmatism, between leadership and ego, that one won't lift so easily. And until it does, the United States will keep reliving the same lesson, over and over again, that democracy isn't undone by its enemies. It's undone by the people who forget how to share it. I'm Rufus Brown, thank you for watching, and good night.